But I just want to welcome up this panel for editing for animation and stop motion, which is moderated by our own VC board member, Maysie Hoy.
Hi, good afternoon, everybody. Why don't you guys introduce yourselves, because I don't want to mess up how I pronounce your names.
I'm Edie Ichioka, and Maysie invited me and Jeff here as animation editors.
Yeah, my name is Jeff Draheim. I've been with Disney for 23 years, and I guess that's why I'm here. So.
Great. Now, every year, like the Motion Picture Guild sponsors this panel, and so this year, Milton and I came up with this idea about, animation editors. And like I said, I'm curious as to how the whole process works. Did you both start out in narrative, like feature narrative or cutting live action? How did you get involved in cutting animation?
I started in video editing. I've actually never edited a live action feature or a television show. I started with video editing of commercials and industrial videos and small documentaries, even some stuff for Disney. But I've loved animation, and growing up I loved special effects, so it was just a great transition for me to be able to come over to Disney Animation Studios and start cutting animation. So it was definitely a shift, whereas in working with even in video projects, you're pretty much given all the footage. They go out, they shot it, they give it to you, and it's your job to make something out of it. Now I'm discovering when I got to animation, it's like you can ask for anything you want. You've got years to make this movie. You're spending 2 years just mocking up a version of your movie before they even start animating a single frame of footage, which I think is just a wonderful process to have that much leeway and that much exploration time.
Well, how long did it take to edit MOANA?
Most of our movies are about 3 years, 3.5 years, and that's usually about the time that the lead editor is usually one of the first ones on or one of the last ones off. So I'm usually on them for about 3 years.
Wow.
Yeah.
And then Edie, how about the box trolls?
The Box Trolls was The Box Trolls, which was closer. The Box Trolls was a stop-motion animation feature, and that took a few years to make. It's a little different than computer-generated animation in that you have these physical models that you move frame by frame. And to make a second of material, you have to move it 24 times because there's 24 frames per second. So it took a few years to make.
So do you have some examples to show us?
Yes, actually, shall we play the one I brought first?
Right.
Okay, this is a progression reel, and what it will show you is the process of animation. It starts with storyboards, which are drawings to portray what's going to happen. Then we go to layout or previs, which is a computer-generated rough sketch of what the scene will be. Then we go to animation, you know what that is. And then lighting, a more finished version. And what you'll see in this reel is how every department pluses the material. It is your responsibility, if you're working on the film, to make whatever you get better. As a storyboard artist, you get the script. How could I improve this? How could I stage it? How could I reinforce the emotion that I'm trying to portray? If you're doing layout, how could I make it filmic? How can I make this environment come alive? If you're animating, you have to bring life to it and be true to the storytelling and emotion. And in lighting, you have to render everything, in some cases, as photoreal as possible. So this is the progression of what happens in animation with all these steps, and every department plussing it. You'll notice it's not an exact cookie cutter of what happened before. The first clip of boards will be shorter, and then it'll be expanded upon and improved. We start with scratch dialogue. This will just be vocalizations in the clip I brought. And then you record the final actor. But in sketching out the material in board form, you are trying to economize with what you actually shoot, because shooting 24 frames a second and having one animator generate 4 seconds in a week you're not getting anywhere really fast. So you have to be very, very judicious in what you select to animate. And that's why you do all these preliminary steps, to be very cautious about where you invest all your time. And that's partly why it takes so long.
So when you're editing animation, it's different than live action because we have to cut what's been shot, like the dailies. So we're handed a bunch of dailies and then we have to figure out, we have to make it work. But in animation, the beauty of it is if you don't have a shot, you just go down the hall and ask the animator to give you that shot or an insert, right?
Well, yeah, actually, usually it's more you're working that way with the story artist. It can be with the animator, but from the very beginning, they'll storyboard an entire sequence, turn it over to the editor. We'll spend a few days starting to put it together. Mm-hmm. And as I'm putting it together, I might realize, boy, this isn't hooking up. And I will call up the board artist and say, hey, can you give me a couple of quick sketches of a wide shot? Or I want to have a character say this line in a close-up, so give it to me with the character with an open mouth. So it's literally like having your director of photography right outside your door. It's like, okay, now I need a wide shot, now I need a medium shot, now I need this. And so it's wonderful having that immediacy of being able to put this together.
So it's like a real collaboration between the editor, the director, the storyboard artist, right?
Absolutely, yeah. It starts from the very beginning. As soon as they got the script and it's approved, they're bringing in the editor and the head of story and the writer, and we're joined at the hip for like the next year and a half. And we all have a really great relationship, and it's constantly working back and forth and stopping by each other's offices and just figuring out ways to plus it. And then once you actually have a sequence put together and you're ready to show it to your directors, you're inviting all those key people in, and everyone's looking at it, and that's almost just where you're starting, because from there everyone has all these great ideas that take it in new directions. Right. So it's constantly evolving, constantly changing.
So you're a staff editor over at Disney?
I guess you could call it that, yeah.
And how long have you been there?
23 years.
Wow, that's great.
Thanks.
And Edie, you're working on Amusement Park right now?
Yes. What you just saw were clips from Amusement Park, which is a Paramount feature animation CG film. And I've been working on that since, for about a year and a half or so. And I've worked at PDI, Aardman, Pixar, DreamWorks, Leica, a lot of different studios.
Which one's your favorite?
Paramount, because it's the one where I'm working right now.
Well, where did you learn how to edit animation?
Well, that's a really interesting story, and I think that all editing and all filmmaking is telling stories. And I think that editors by nature have to be very adaptive and be able to work with, the technology is always changing and the terrain is always changing. So no matter what, you can't have your one way of doing something. Unless you work somewhere for 23 years, you can have one way of doing something. But you actually sort of have to adapt to the house style if you work at different places. If you work at Pixar, there's a certain way you lay out your tracks. There's a certain procedure because you have to fit into the pipeline. Animation feature work has to have a well-defined pipeline because you have to get your materials from boards to previs to layout to animation to lighting, and those transitions have to be incredibly well-defined for the machine to work well. Newer companies might be able to pass things down the hall in a more haphazard way, but big companies don't have that luxury, so you have to conform to the way things are done or improve them with a lot of difficulty in consultation.
And so, Jeff, so you worked in video, and then how did you progress into animation?
Well, I was working for a post house in Orlando, and at the time, Disney had a studio in Florida. And I only took this job at this post house because one of their clients was Disney. And I even told the sales guy, okay, start pairing me up with the Disney clients. I want to get my foot in the door. And it took a couple of years, but finally said, okay, there's an opening. And they were doing animation at the studio, but they had a small division called Animation Services. And their job was to handle any ancillary projects related to the features. Like if Pocahontas just came out, we would do special Pocahontas animation for a Burger King commercial. We would also do special animation or behind-the-scenes videos for anything related to the theme parks. So it was like a big full-time job. There was always something going on. And it was also a great learning experience for me because I loved animation, but I had never cut it before. And the editor I replaced, he moved up to be a producer, and so he was almost like a mentor to me. He was able to walk me through the process. These are the storyboards, and your job is to cut these, and then you start putting in sound effects and start figuring out timings. And if you don't feel you have the right boards, you go back and you ask for more. And so I learned so much from him, just the whole process, and it helped me that I was starting on very small, a little 10-second insert in a commercial, and then it just sort of grew and grew and grew. So it was a very gradual progression over like a couple of years, where then I started working on a couple of little shorts for Disney, and then I helped develop Brother Bear, one of their earlier features there at the Florida studio. And so that just kind of helped get the experience of learning how to cut storyboards and animation.
Well, I think you brought something to share with us, so why don't we take a look at that, and you can
actually,
explain
Edie set it
a
up very well. This is mine from MOANA. Pretty much the same categories: story, layout, animation. We also added one called visual effects, just because so many of our films are so heavy on visual effects. That's a whole other pass that we get that has to go through Sweatbox and approvals, and then final lighting. So if you want to go ahead and play that.
Do people know what Sweatbox is?
Oh yeah, Sweatbox is when you actually have like a shot of animation and it's ready to be reviewed, and so everybody crams into the editorial suite with the directors, head of story, the animators, layout, effects people. There's about 20 people in there, and you will look at the shots one by one, and each department will contribute whatever they feel they need to. Everyone will have comments or criticisms or suggest changes. It's a very long process. It goes on for every single shot, and sometimes you'll do it repeatedly. You'll first sweatbox the animation version, then you'll sweatbox the effects version, then you'll sweatbox final lighting. It just goes on and on all the way up until the release date. So.
And that's a term that originated at Disney but is used at all the studios at this point.
Yeah, I guess it used to happen like under these like stairs in a very crowded room, and it was very hot, so they called it the sweat box. And believe me, there are times where you're still sweating in there, so that aspect hasn't changed at all. So, you want to go ahead and roll that?
Go, Mark.
And I also want to mention, I think you touched upon it a little bit, but not only is every department bringing something to the table at every stage, but the editor is also heavily involved with those departments. We're working hand in hand with the layout artists, trying to figure out the staging and the camera blocking and even picking lenses. We're working with the animators, and they might be wanting a few extra frames for some gag, or we might be saying, you know what, can we lose 12 frames at the end? But all the way up through final lighting, we're still doing our job of trimming and cutting and making adjustments, tracking sound effects. It never ends.
So when you show a piece, well, we're talking about, sound effects and dialogue. I have little, very limited knowledge about animation, but it's kind of it's not backwards, but it's almost like you record your voices first, and then you go and animate.
Yes.
Whereas in live action, you've already recorded the person.
Well, and not only that, but
right?
in the first year and a half in storyboards, we're not even recording our actors. That's too expensive to bring them in.
Right.
So we're just doing our own internal scratch. The directors might do a couple of voices. One of our writers, she was doing all the scratch for MOANA. It's just quick, it's down and dirty.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes we'll even just record them at a microphone into the Avid directly. Your goal is just to try and get some semblance of the story put together so that you can sit back, look at it, and say, okay, now this is the movie I want to make. It's almost like we're creating this living, breathing script for like a year and a half to help us guide it.
And of course, there's music that you add to it, right?
Absolutely. We have a great music editor that helps on all of our films, and we work very closely with them, and they're always in tune with whatever the latest feature is. Like with MOANA, it definitely has to be very Polynesian, very different from the soundtrack to Frozen or Zootopia. So it's definitely working hand in hand with them.
Well, talking about Frozen, how long was that process?
That was also about 3 years. Yeah, it feels like as soon as I finish one movie, boom, I'm on to the next. 3 years, then on to the next.
So when you're reading these scripts, did you get a sense that Frozen was going to be such a huge success?
Nope. Not even close. Our movies evolve so much, and with MOANA, Frozen, everything I've ever done. The movie you see in the theaters, that's not the movie we started out making. I mean, I joke that we spend a year just trying to figure out what movie not to make. And we even joke that every movie at some point at our studio is the worst movie ever made. A year and a half ago, MOANA was unwatchable. It's like, we're not sure we're going to even find a story here. Same with Frozen. It used to be called Snow Queen, completely different beats. So you just keep plugging away. I will say the biggest help to us in guiding us is John Lasseter, ever since he became the chief creative officer. I think the guy is just a story genius, and he sits in, especially in the last year of your production, he's joining you every week. He's sitting in editorial. I'm sure you experienced that on Toy Story too. Yeah, but he's our generation's Walt Disney, in my opinion. So.
I completely agree with that. And the one, I think, big misconception is when you get a script, that script translates to the screen. There's the written script, and then there's the visual script. And what very frequently happens is people think it's just sort of, oh, okay, just place that on the screen and that's what you're going to get. It's a completely different animal. Translating to the visual script changes everything and usually sends the director into deep states of despair for a small period of time. But it's your job as an editor to help with the rewriting of that visual script. And you go down a lot of rabbit holes and you don't get it right the first time. I think that there's a real temptation for the audience to think, oh, this is the film they intended to make and they added some music and sound effects and there you are. You go down a lot of rabbit holes. You add characters, take away characters, change characters entirely, change the whole plot. You start out with every film with goals and limitations. Your goal to make a movie about a lost fish, and your limitation is you have X million dollars. Well, then the goal of the story changes, and your budget gets a little bigger because you're asked for some more money, and everything moves around until you actually wind up with the film that you have. But the old chestnut is true. Films are not finished, they're abandoned. You actually have to get it done, and you make decisions to simplify and get this blue sky version into a form where you can show it in a theater.
So, do you test screen these pictures?
Yeah, we do at Disney. We usually try to have one audience preview, maybe about 4 or 5 months ahead of time. And a lot of that is just for clarity. I think by that point, our movie is pretty solid, but we just want to make sure, is the audience understanding everything? Because even by that point, we've all seen it 100 times, even Lasseter. Want to make sure that, are we bringing baggage that they're not seeing? So just to see if there's any feedback or any notes of clarity. So it's just helpful to figure out where the laughs are. Sometimes it's even like, boy, they were laughing a lot. We need to open that up before the next line of dialogue comes in. So we use it for that. It's also very beneficial for our marketing department. They actually get a lot from the screenings. They can tell after with the surveys, okay, how did girls respond? How did boys respond? How did parents respond? So they can start figuring out their marketing approach.
And the companies break it down to a very granular level. Not only do they ask what the confusions were, what were your favorite characters, they get your age range, your sex, they also break it down for animation differently in that when you screen with storyboards or layout, they have a metric to measure how people are reacting to a film in that state. So they can rank you very accurately if they think, oh, well, it's not really realized yet since it's not animated, and there's a little film that we show them before that shows the progression, something very similar to what you saw. So if it doesn't look right, if it doesn't look photoreal, be assured it will be replaced with something that is photoreal. If it doesn't look right, just give us the benefit of the doubt and try to ride along with the story.
That's the hard part is like I say, we try to do it 4 or 5 months ahead of time. We're making our movies up until the last day. So when we're screening for an audience, half of it's in storyboards. And that does scare us. It's like, we can read storyboards, but can Mr. and Mrs. Average American read storyboards? And fortunately, most often they can. So it is a big relief.
What was impressive about MOANA, I mean, I'm always fascinated by water. How did they draw water to make it look real, right? The giant wave. So when you first get that, how does it look?
Yeah, it's interesting because I spend 2 years in storyboards, and then I start to get layout, and the layout is even very just kind of rough and blocky. And then when you start to actually get the animation, I gotta say, even after 23 years, I'm blown away. I mean, I was amazed at what was coming across my desk and how realistic. In fact, there were some people that said, so you shot real water and you added the boats in? I said, no, it's just our Disney animators, the CG technology. They're just amazing what they can do.
And then is the animation done here in the States or is it outsourced?
It's all done. It's all done at our studio,
Oh,
yeah,
wow.
absolutely, yeah. Same with Pixar, everything is in-house.
And how about box trolls? Where was that? You worked up in Portland for a long
Yes,
time, right?
we were up in Portland doing that picture, and it was stop motion animation with an effects element too. You work with a lot of limitations in stop motion. You might have 5 puppets of the protagonist, but you might have 8 people who need to shoot the protagonist that day. Well, okay, we have to allocate materials in certain ways, and we don't have the set, so you shoot green screen for a lot of the stop motion, which doesn't make a lot of sense when you think animation, but it is physical sets, physical puppets that you're using, so there's a lot of comping that goes on. We were lucky enough to have a whole department that was doing our comping right across the street that is part of Leica, and they would take out the seams that have for the replaceable mouths, because every syllable is worked out in advance and printed on a 3D printer, so the mouth shapes are correct. But they were removing seams every day. They were doing everything in-house, all the comping, all the special effects. One thing that I think a lot of animation editors are called upon to do now with all the functionality of the Avid is do a lot of effects in the Avid. So there'd be a lot of green screen comping, a lot of repositioning. Even in boards, even if we might not be very talented in that way, we have to do a lot of painting, like we were saying, opening the mouth for when they talk, or the eye direction is wrong from cut to cut. You erase the eyeballs and you paint them in. And repositioning characters so the eye trace is right where your eyes are led from cut to cut. And so there's a lot more in terms of rejigging artistically what the boards look like in editing that used to only exist in boards back in the day.
Yeah, we used Photoshop and After Effects are our best friends. And we
Yes.
just loved relying on that. Anything to help enhance the reels, because the audience is just looking at still images. So if you can do something to add camera moves or a little multi-planing effect or just a few bells and whistles, it's like, and it doesn't take too much time, we'll go ahead and do some simple version of that.
And it also informs the animator and layout
Yeah.
for what you are envisioning for
Absolutely.
the reel.
I'm curious, because I love stop motion animation. Is there a different process that you went through with the story reel, getting it up ready for animation, as opposed to like some of your other, like Toy Story 2 or some of the other CG films?
That part of it, the board part was pretty similar, but there's one thing that ended up being very common in terms of superimposing, and that's, I don't know if your animators do a lot of live action videos on their phones.
Sometimes, yeah.
Yeah, and so we would cut those into the reels
Yeah.
very frequently, and the same animator would act out the part of the protagonist on his phone, and then act out the part of the person talking to them on his phone, and then you send it to edit, and we'd cut those together and superimpose those over the board so they had a sense of where they were going, what they were doing for when the animation came in.
Interesting, okay.
So going back to box trolls, and you're talking about the stop action. Now, there's quite a few scenes where there's a lot of things going on. So is that like, so if you have a scene like that, how many layers do you have when you're putting it together? Because each action or each character is like is it on one layer, like one video, and then you continue to add it?
Yeah, you end up nesting a lot of different layers together and doing a lot of comping in the Avid. I mean, it's a much more comping intensive situation that you would find in a lot of live action films. It really sort of came into play in the last decade, where I think we were doing a lot more of that sort of work in the Avid, and the technology's really come along.
And then so we were talking about 3D a while back, before we came on. And I had, one of the first of these panel discussions, I had interviewed Steve Rifkin and John Raffoa, who just, Avatar had just been released. And we're talking about how that show, that movie changed a lot of things in this industry, like 3D, for instance, and you were talking about the different formats now that's in existence because of that. Can you, both of you, explain a little bit? Also, how do you, you're converting to 3D, say, these animated movies, once it's finished, right?
Well, no, for the more recent films, they actually plan ahead of time to go down a 3D path at the same time. You know, fortunately, it's all digital, so they can just have this alternate path going on with cameras that they'll split into the two versions. And I'm not sure how they arrived at this, and I don't mind it, but they actually don't even send me the 3D version. It's like that happens completely separate, and they will have reviews, and I'm invited to all those if I have time. And John Lasseter will look at them in the theater, but it's never in the Avid, so I don't really even weigh in that much on the 3D element of it.
You were talking about the different aspects of 3D, right? In more technical terms,
Right.
I guess.
Well, 3D is something that I think in feature animation is almost a given now with any big studio film, and it enters in a lot earlier now. This film I'm on right now, we've initiated 3D layout, which I'd never.
Wow.
I know.
No, again, we're not doing that.
Yeah.
God.
And one thing that's really important now for editors to weigh in on is not only eye trace, how you're carrying the eye across the screen from cut to cut or within a shot, but it's depth trace. And I think so much of what people react to when they don't like 3D is being jarred in an unpleasurable way when the filmmakers really didn't mean to. If you're tromboned in and out of certain depths without any sort of purpose to it, it is one of those things where your friends say, yeah, that 3D gave me a headache. Well, it's because the audience has been abused in that case. If you carry it through gracefully and you use the 3D judiciously, that's an important thing. One newer item that has taken place in feature animation editing is not only a color script where you sort of map out the color progression of your film, but a depth script, which shows when you're going to have super 3D moments, as she's dangling off the building, as the car is driving towards you. You don't want to have that 100% of the time. You want to have very specific and well-regulated super 3D moments, and you don't want to bunch them too close together. One rule of thumb that people often use, too, is to have one super 3D moment at the very beginning, so people say, that's why I spent $350 on my glasses. And then they could just sort of settle into it.
Well, I find that even in live action, if you're watching 3D and it's badly done, the panning can really throw you off.
It'll give you a headache, yeah.
It'd give you a headache.
Yeah.
And it's almost like you're wearing monovision, glasses.
Absolutely, and that's part of the abuse. I think for me, when I'm cutting super short shots, I prefer to have that 3D actually eliminated. In the audience's mind, we're still in 3D, but if you don't have that depth to it, people are not going to register it in a super short cut. So I think that there's a lot of abuses that go on, a lot of people saying, well, this is just a very dynamic 3D show, rather than using it as an ingredient. It becomes this sort of dominant element.
Yeah, Disney's approach lately has always been less is more. I think they've learned feedback from audiences, especially when they're taking, some of the audience members are 2-4 years old. You don't want to hit them over the head. It just, it throws them off. It bothers little kids. They will start crying. Mm-hmm. And they've learned that. So they really just have backed way, way off, and it's always very subtle. And I do remember, I think there was like a month-long conversation about MOANA 3D, trying to figure out, okay, well, they're on a boat, they're on this water, and the water's coming at you, so what's that point? What's that 3D point? Is like, do we put the boat on the screen and the water's coming out at you, or does the water start at the screen and the boat's back? They just have to do all these tests to figure out what isn't going to be entertaining, but still, not bother or throw you off in any way.
So what part of the process are you in now?
Right now in the show I'm on, we're in, a lot of the processes run parallel. So it's not, we don't sort of exit one chamber and go to the next chamber, especially with what we were saying about the constant rewrites. So you might be in boards and be boarding a whole sequence while you're in layout in another sequence. The egg doesn't go through the snake all at once. It just sort of, the snake eats bits and bobs, and you can be in layout and boards and animation and lighting all at the same time. We're mostly wrapping up animation and going into lighting at this point, but there's a lot of animation left to do. But I also got some layout in recently. So
What show are you working on?
I'm working on a feature animation show called Amusement Park that's being directed by Dylan Brown, who I worked with on Toy Story 2, who's an amazing director. And it has some amazing voice talent, and it's going to be great.
And when's that coming out?
Next summer. 2018.
And Jeff, what are you working on now?
I am actually starting up on Frozen 2, which I can talk about because they just announced it a couple of days ago. That comes out November of 2019. So we're in the early stages. We're lucky one of our directors, Jennifer Lee, is also the writer, which I find very helpful. So she's still working through the script. I think we kind of have a rough act one. So we have board artists who are just now starting to board. I've been given like maybe 6 or 7 sequences, but it's that early stage where none of our actors are in. It's all just scratch. It's almost more exploratory.
So the first Frozen, was the score written before the animation was done?
Score or songs?
The songs.
The songs. That's hand in hand. You know, on Frozen we worked with Bobby and Kristen Lopez, and they are a valuable part of our storytelling process, and they're brought in also from the very beginning. And they're in New York, but we would have video conference calls with them 2 or 3 times a week, and they would just start, you know, banging away on their piano and, you know, say, oh, I'm thinking about this as a theme, and as they're getting ideas from our writer, and they're coming up with ideas and sending us demos. So it does go hand in hand. And so we won't move into a sequence until we at least have some sort of a rough demo of what we want a song to be.
So what was the first animated feature that you worked on, Jeff?
The first one was
That you
Brother.
cut.
Oh, that I cut? That would be Princess and the Frog. It's interesting. I started Brother Bear. I was at the Florida studio, and I was working with the producer was a good friend of mine, and he was good friends with this animator. And they were developing an idea for a story about a boy who turns into a bear. And this was back in the days before everyone could edit at home, and you had all the home facilities. So they said, well, you know, Jeff, why don't you help us out with this? So we were doing it kind of in our spare time, and I said, let's just get Act 1 up in the story reel form. And so I did cut Act 1 of Brother Bear as a story reel. They brought the executives out from California and showed it to them, and they loved it, and that's when they greenlit the project. Now, I'll also say then, that was the most I'd ever done, and I had a talk with the head of post-production, and we agreed that I was not ready to take on a feature to edit, because it's a huge job. It's big. And I agreed, so I said, Jeff, you're going to be the associate editor. We're going to bring another editor out. He'll be the lead editor, but you are going to stick to him like glue. And so it was great. I learned so much from him going through that first movie, and he let me actually cut most of the sequences and storyboards, but I was able to see how he was handling directors and handling all the different departments. So by the time I got to Princess and the Frog, I mean, it was kind of second nature. And actually in between those two, when I came out to California, I did start at, it's a division called Disneytoon Studios. Back then, that was the branch that did all the kind of not so great sequels, direct to DVD. So I did like a Brother Bear 2, Kronk's New Groove. So I kind of did those two, but Princess and the Frog was my first feature.
And how about you, Edie?
The first animated feature that I edited was Toy Story 2, but to speak to what you were saying about score or songs, one thing that I found, which is kind of an interesting thing in feature animation, is if you have songs in a movie, like in Nightmare Before Christmas, we had a bunch of songs. Those were the first to get turned over to animation because they're finite in length. So the animator doesn't open up the song. You have certain shots that you designate within the song, and those are more secure very frequently to go to animation. So we get very tired of the songs because we hear them for 3 years.
Let it go.
That's it. But that seems to be a pattern, I think, in feature animation.
Yeah, the same with
there's
us. If we
songs
could ever
involved.
get a song, that was always,
Yeah.
partly too, we'd always try to figure out a big action sequence in Act 3, because that's going to take a long time. So let's try to get that into the pipeline as quickly as possible, too.
And that's actually a really interesting point, which is Act 3. A lot of different studios have a situation where you start on Act 1, and you refine it, you get notes, you refine it, you get notes. Act 2, refine it, get notes, right? And to get to Act 3 often comes too late in the process to really embrace it in the same way you've done Act 1 and 2. And that seems to be a very common thing in feature animation that I think a lot of editors always encourage producers and directors to get something up for Act 3. Just get it together, because that's the last thing to really sort of gel.
Yeah, I mean, lately, for our last few films, even over the last 10 years, it's like every time we want to get the movie up, let's get the whole movie up in early versions.
Exactly.
And sometimes it's like, oh boy, we're screening every 12 weeks, but Act 3 will just be like a storybook, like beat boards. And it might even have a narrator. Well, in this scene, MOANA's going to try to get into the, you know, and that's what you're playing for your audience. But at least it gives you a sense of the overall story, so that if you are making adjustments in Act 1, okay, but it's going to have a rippling effect in Act 3, obviously. Or if you want to adjust something in Act 3, great, but it's going to have a big change in Act 1. So we're always trying to look at the whole thing all the time.
Now, Edie, you started out in San Francisco, Berkeley, and you worked with Walter Murch.
Yes.
Who's an editing icon,
Yeah.
in our world. So how did you transition into animation?
Well, working for Walter, of course, was amazing, and I learned a tremendous amount. He, for people who don't know, is a brilliant editor who has really made some of, this generation's most amazing film. He's participated in The Godfather and Conversation, and I worked for him on The English Patient. He did Cold Mountain, and his approach and philosophy to editing is unbelievable, and assisting him was an education. And actually, my husband and I made a feature-length documentary film about his edit process that we took to a bunch of different film festivals. But the transition from working in live action to at Salzans Film Festival, where I met you when you were working over there on, was it Joy Luck Club
Joy
where you
Luck
were?
Club, yeah.
We were cutting over there when we were working at the Salzans, to Toy Story 2 at that time was just sort of knowing editing and storytelling, and whatever new sort of methodologies there were, I'd learn them. So it wasn't a completely different animal in that way, because storytelling. The learning the methodologies was something you have to do. It's a little different. Editing is the hub of all information in animation. In live action, everything travels through editing more like a tube. You get all of your footage and you sculpt from that clay. In animation, you have to order finite amounts of clay to sort of assemble your sculpture. It's sort of a different animal, but you end up with the same sculpture.
So what kind of advice would you give to our audience, some of the people that would, like to get involved in animation?
Well, I think that the advice of getting into animation is to educate yourself. Watch every DVD extra of how they made the film. I think that those, even though they don't say, oh my God, this is so hard, you're gonna work so hard, you're not gonna believe it. They leave that part out. It's very, very difficult. You have to keep your enthusiasm up for years. It's not a little sprint, it's a marathon. So you have to constantly be inspired and renewed, and you constantly have to do that thing I was mentioning before, which is plussing the material. Never go in and say, there's a problem. Go in and say, hey, here's something that could offer a solution to this situation. Always be thinking of a way out of anything you perceive as a problem. Offer alternatives. Always be inspired. Always try to do what's best to service the story. If you're trying to get a job in animation, the old way was, hey, volunteer in the cutting room or volunteer as an animator, but that doesn't really hold water with union and all that. So what I would suggest is get a job as a PA and be really, really good, come early, stay late, do things that you're not supposed to do when there's nothing to do. Hey, wow, the supply room's really clean. Who did that? It was Jane. Oh, she's awesome. Wow, she's coming around when things don't look too busy in editing and asking questions or seeing if we need some Xeroxing. That's awesome. Hey.
I'm going to back that up because my first assistant, his name's Bryan Millman. He's with me now on Frozen 2. We did MOANA together. He was also with me on Frozen. He started out as a PA just literally like 10, 12 years ago. And he always wanted to get involved in editing, but every time I saw him, he was always sitting at this desk, doing secretarial stuff. But he just worked really, really hard and just tried to get his foot in the door. And he said, I'm glad to help. I'll do whatever I can. And I will say right now, he is the best first assistant at Disney Animation. It's like people are jealous that I got him on my team. So it does pay to come in that way to figure out, side avenues. There's also some interesting advice that I give. I've talked to high school kids once in a while, and I will tell them, read comic books. I did it as a kid growing up, and I think it just really helps reinforce that visual connectivity of being able to see what information is being conveyed in this one drawing. And now my eye's ready to go to the next drawing and then do the next. And that, I think, really helps me cut storyboards. And fortunately, I think comic books it's a great visual medium, especially these days. There's a lot of great material out there. So keep reading. That's what I tell my wife, and that's why I still buy comic books.
So over the years, have you found that the animation world has changed a lot since you got in?
For me, definitely. I was brought in, I joke, I was hired with Lion King money back when the studio was really doing great. And that was also back when it was all hand-drawn. But I remember, I think a few months in, my boss came in and they had these story reels. They said, well, we just got these from this tiny little company up north called Pixar. The movie's called Toy Story, and it was all just story reels. So it's like, that was still in its infancy. So I've seen it go from hand-drawn animation all the way to the CG world. I think even technically, I think part of it is just that at Disney, we always keep raising that bar so high. But when I did come in, we were just starting to work on an Avid. So you could have, I think, 2 tracks of video, 4 tracks of audio. I mean, it was amazing how limited. Back then it was great, but it was so limiting. And now we're filling up 64 tracks of audio just for a story reel and multiple channels of video. And it's just that that bar's gotten so high that that's just kind of what is expected every time we do a presentation.
So have you worked with the same director?
I've been fortunate. I've worked with Ron and John, John Musker and Ron Clements. They directed MOANA. They also did Princess and the Frog. And then I did work with Chris Buck and Jen Lee on Frozen, and now they're doing Frozen 2. So I've been kind of lucky that it's, it feels like family every time that we're together, and we know each other's, secondhand shortcuts, things like that. So it's helpful.
How about you, Edie?
I've worked with a variety of directors, but in sometimes in different capacities. When I worked for the director I'm working for now, Dylan Brown, he was a supervising animator, which is like a director for a group of animators, and now he's directing his first feature. So what's nice is we have this shared experience, and we have a shorthand which comes in incredibly handy when he is in Spain supervising some of the animation, lighting, and layout, and we have cross-sites every day, and he knows that I'm going to, when he's asleep, start sending him solutions that he can look at and talk to me about in any sort of cross-site video, which is incredibly handy. But also to speak to what we were discussing about the technology, what's really interesting that's really changed in the cutting room since I've started is the role of editor and the role of assistant. I used to stand behind my editor and hand her the clip that she was going to want in film and think about, oh, I bet she's going to ask me for the close-up next because she's going to want to see the reaction and, try to second guess what they're doing and have a better insight into her process of thinking. And now assistants are down the hall because you don't have to hand them a physical clip. It's all digital. So the learning for an assistant isn't as immediate. They'll see tentpole, check-ins and what work they do, but they don't see the conversations with the director. You were talking about, how the editor was interfacing with the director. There's a real skill and finesse to that, and I'm still working on that. But,
Let's see what mood they're in that day.
Yeah, that's it.
Yeah.
Well, I'm finding that, cutting on Avid, your assistant is in the next room. And they, how do you pass that skill on? I mean, and then, when you finish a scene, you show it to your assistant and then you get the feedback. But right, back in the day, you'd sit next to the editor and watch them work. And so how big is your crew?
It's interesting on Disney, and this has happened, I think, over the last 10 or so years, is that originally it was very structured. The lead editor would cut the picture and dialogue, and then he would give it to the associate editor who would do sound effects. It just kind of went through this assembly line. But even back on Brother Bear, I found that I was doing all the sound effects, but then the editor, Tim, was also allowing me to cut most of the sequences, or at least take a first pass. And that was it was a great education for me. And I was so grateful for that's what I do now. I have 3 or 4 people on my crew, and they're all cutting. As soon as storyboards come in, I'll take the first sequence, and then if I get a second one and I'm not ready for it, I'll tell my associate editor, okay, why don't you start working on that? Hey, we got another one. First assistant, you go work on that one. As long as it's not interfering with their normal work, they love it because it gives them that experience to learn how to cut. And then time permitting, they'll come in, we'll look at it together, I'll give them notes, I'll give them feedback, they'll go off and do the notes. It gets a little tough when you're in the last 6 months and it's all crazy. It's like, just start assembling this, I need it done tonight, I'm gonna jump on it at 4 o'clock tomorrow morning, so just do as much as you can. So, but it's a great learning experience for them, and I think all the crews at Disney are now doing that.
No, that's the only way you learn, is if you have a mentor or someone that trusts you and like your work ethics. And I think that's one of the most important things not just in animation, but in the feature world, in the film business, is, to show your enthusiasm and have a positive attitude, when you come into the cutting room, because nobody wants, negativity, and because that adds, to a stressful room.
Absolutely.
So I think that that's something that we've all had to learn on the job, so that, the newer generation coming in, that's the focus that they should have, is you could have gone to school and you were the top editor there, well, big deal. That doesn't mean anything when you get out into the real world. So I think that what you guys are doing is great, passing on, the information.
And I got to admit, after 23 years, it's like I'm done doing the heavy lifting. Just get it all up in the timeline, get some sound effects in there, and I'll take it from there. So I'm happy to, spread the work around a little bit.
So how do you choose your team?
Well, the first question I ask is, what is your superpower? And that's a really telling question. If they come in and say, well, my superpower is that I can read the edit room and I can sort of sense what's going on, and I try to create a serene space and get my work done, but I'm also incredibly organized. It's like, oh, those are good superpowers. Or I'm incredibly good at databases. Or you find the skill that fits, but I'm always curious what their superpower is. It's like, oh, you're great at writing scripts that automate, making in and out points 2 seconds and 4 seconds into each clip, and then organizing bins so that, it creates a droplet for this bin. It's like, oh, I like that. So right now, one thing that's happened to assistant editing is it's become less of a training ground for editors and more of a technically focused role. And sometimes people even enter it just to be technically focused and don't want to become an editor, which is an unusual thing from when I started. But I'm always focused in on what their superpower is and how that fits into the greater picture.
Yeah, it's interesting. I also look, I have two guys that I've been working with since Frozen, and I'm very loyal to them. And one of them is a stronger editor. The other one is stronger when it comes to the technical knowledge. And I like that, because we have a great technology department at Disney, but when something's getting screwed up at 8 o'clock at night or 6 o'clock in the morning, I have a hotline to him, or he's already there, so he can help me. And he's able to fix problems instantly instead of having to wait half an hour for tech to support to show up. So I do kind of look for that balance. I don't want a bunch of heavy hitters and everyone can edit, because then they're all going to be arguing over who gets to cut what. So I like to have that balance of people.
So talking about balance, how do you balance family life when you have schedules like
you
this?
don't.
Or do
You
you
don't.
have a family life? Or do you have a life?
Yeah, it's so hard. I mean, and lately our films, I think because the bar is so high, the stories are just so hard. It's like we say, we got to crack this story. We got to crack the story. And MOANA was one of the hardest experiences I ever went through. I mean, I was working 90, 95 hours a week for months. And you get to the point where you're sleeping on your couch, and it's just, it is tough trying to figure out that balance. But Disney is a great company, and they are so aware of it, and they are trying to do so much to figure out ways to help improve that. They're looking at release schedules and trying to figure out, well, how often are we screening? Do we have to screen that often? Can we give people a little bit more time? So I think it's just trying to figure that. We're trying to figure out how to edit at home. It's tough because there's so much security involved that you can't just, tap in on the internet and log in. So we are trying to figure out ways to do more and more away from work. So whatever we can do.
Can we open it up to the audience? Michael.
I'm a huge fan of animation, so one of my proudest professional moments was actually being credited on Frozen. And I wanted to ask you if the participation of a cinematographer is valuable in different ways to you. As like the way Roger Deakins worked on Wall-E, and obviously on something like Box Trolls, yes, definitely, because you're doing dimensional animation. But in terms of other CG forms of animation, is there a place for somebody like the cinematographer in that chain?
I think totally. I come to rely so much. That's pretty much our head of layout. He's the director, the cinema photographer, and he's so terrific and got such a great knowledge. He's the guy that's given me multiple versions with different lenses on them, and he and I will talk about staging. Because our boards can be really, really, really rough. And even I'll be like, I don't know what you're going to do with this. And so I'm just amazed at what they can come up with in terms of that staging. And then they're also figuring in the lighting. I'm so impressed with that. I'm sorry, but you were in the credits for Frozen?
Yeah, I did a demo for the Disney animators where we came to a studio at Mole Richardson, and then I brought in 8 tons of ice and snow and showed
terrific.
them how to light ice and snow for color,
Okay.
color and texture.
That's Michael Goy. He's an amazing
Thank you.
cinematographer.
And on the show I'm currently on, we brought in Dan Mindell, who's Star Trek and, wonderful cinematographer. And of course, Sharon Callahan over at Pixar, amazing cinematographer. So there's a very strong role for cinematographers in animation. And one thing that Jeffrey Katzenberg would always say during the first pitches of boards was, it has to be more filmic, it has to be more filmic.
More
And
cinematic, yeah.
Yeah,
Yep.
and it really is important to incorporate those ideas early.
And it's amazing how I've seen that change, because it wasn't quite that way when it was hand-drawn. I mean, you were kind of drawing whatever lens it was, and then you did get boxed in pretty quickly. This is the angle. It's going to be too expensive for us to redraw this from a different angle. So we do approach our CG films like a live-action film, where we're moving that camera wherever we need to.
And
So-
changing lenses.
So Edie, do you think that are there more women animation editors now?
I don't think there are enough. I don't think it's anywhere near 50-50 at this point. I think that it's not a profession that it has been growing that dramatically with women. There's certainly women who are animating on the film that I'm on, but very, very few. So much so that you always know the women's names and you don't know all the guys' names.
I agree, and I actually, we have a woman editor now, Fabienne Raleigh. She did Zootopia. She's just amazing. I just love her style. I love her approach. And I've worked with female editors in the past. One of them's up at Pixar right now, and they just bring a great sensibility to their cutting. It's like we have so many guys. Sometimes it does get a little bit too much. You can tell a guy cut this.
Testosterone.
Yeah, exactly. So, and I'm sure I'm guilty of that myself. So.
Hi. I heard that you mentioned you choose lenses and can talk to the board artists for shots and stuff, and I'd assumed that was more of a director's responsibility, but could you talk a bit about the kind of the line between that and editing in animation as opposed to live action?
It is a director's responsibility in the end, but I feel that sometimes it's more just to buy off on it. I've been lucky to work with directors that love to empower their people, and they would rather I spend time working with the layout artist and us figuring out our paths. And same way with the board artists. It's like, okay, me and the head of story, we've now got a version, and now we're ready to show it. The directors will come in, they'll definitely have ideas, they'll have thoughts. Sometimes they might look at it and say, yeah, wow, this is great, let's move on. So the directors definitely are the very back end for approvals.
And there's so much that a director does on an animated feature. Often there'll be 2 directors on animated
Absolutely.
features, and that won't even be enough to cover everything, but you can't spread that responsibility too much further without having difficulties. Wars are fought where boundaries are ill-defined, so you have to really be very clear about what everyone's role is, but in those ways, we have to offer something. We have to say, is this right? We don't know if this is right. How about it? What would you change? Because if you wait for the director to give instructions for every element, you're never going to get it done.
Yeah.
There's just too many, everything needs to be fabricated in animation. Every bottle, pen, color of tablecloth, and a director can't do everything. So he has to, or she has to trust their team to channel them. And make sense of their instructions. Sometimes they're not going to be available to you, and you know their sensibility. Oh, the note says turn left here. Well, if you turn left here, there's going to be a problem. Do what they want, not what they say. It's really important to remember that. Do what they want, not what they say, because the note doesn't take into account when you cut out those 3 shots, there's going to be a jump cut. The note doesn't take into account that there's going to be a continuity error. That might be okay, but do the cut they want, but also offer an alternate cut that shows another way around.
So it's like self-motivation, you know? It's like, you know, when you're working with, even in live action, if you sit around and wait for the director to show up to tell you how to cut, well, you're on the next bus out of there.
Yeah.
There just aren't enough hours in the day for them. So it's
Yeah.
like, I'm just gonna do something and, you know,
Right.
we'll have material, we'll have options ready for them. It's
Right.
like, that's what it all is.
Yeah.
But it's great because then they like it. You're offering some creative influence into it, you know, and 9 times out of 10, you're heading in a direction that you're gonna build upon. So it's more rewarding that way too, as opposed to just being, you know, someone, okay, tell me what to do next.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
And the 2 shows that you're working on, it's part of the IA, the union?
Yes.
Yes.
Yes. Union is important.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Especially when you're working those hours, you know?
Yes,
And-
absolutely.
And so it's really important to have a union that protects you so that you're really not fully taken advantage of.
Absolutely. And they came around with cupcakes yesterday to the studio, so
they?
we like our union.
I mean, we're lucky at Disney. There's also a vice president of post-production, and she is the one that's actually watching over everything. I mean, she's in constant talk with the editors and also the producers and the directors. And well, you guys have got a lot of hours. Would it be helpful if we brought another editor in to kind of help out, another assistant here or there? So, like I said, they're very, very concerned about us. You know, don't want us to work us too hard.
So Edie, do you have another, is there a second editor working with you?
I have an associate editor who's wonderful, Chris Campbell, working with me, and I have a couple assistants, and they're great. It's a very, actually this department is very heavily female and very heavily Asian for some reason. It's an unusual combination.
Anybody else?
Thank you. I was wondering, it's kind of like a two-parter, but you say that you work on a film probably for around 3 years. I was wondering if there's any time, like during that 3 years, that you kind of feel like there's a passion project that you're working on or anything that you're interested in like pursuing while you're also working. And I was also wondering if there's any good moments that you kind of, it's called like getting rid of your darlings, like any moments in those 3 years that you're like, I love this scene, it's so great, we got to get rid of it. Like what kind of scenes are like that?
I definitely over the 3 years, I hate being bored. I hate when we have nothing to do. And sure enough, on all of our films, it's not working, so they have to go out and do a complete rewrite, and then you have 6 weeks with nothing to do. So I'll be the first one to step up and say, you know, can I help out on this short film? I'm very just passionate. I love doing the short ones because you can get in and out of those in like 6 months. So I was very fortunate. I was able to edit the short film Feast that actually won an Oscar a couple of years ago. So if I have an opportunity to ever jump in and do little projects like that, it also kind of gives me that mental break to go away from things a little bit. So, yeah.
Often at the larger studios, they will have a lot of different projects going on. So at DreamWorks, when there's a rewrite, they'll put an editor on to help out with Madagascar 3 or a Penguin movie. So they scoop people around when there's a rewrite, and rewrites are very common in feature animation. When they decide, oh, okay, we screened it, this area needs some work, hit pause, send people out to help on the other shows. And I think that that's one really great thing about the larger companies is you can pivot very easily and be reassigned very easily, and that kind of refreshes you. Outside of that, I don't think contractually you're kind of allowed to work at other studios or on other projects. So if you work on your own stuff, that's a good thing, as long as that's okay with the agreement. In terms of losing your darlings, I think that we do that sort of on a weekly basis, honestly. I mean, I think that there's material that is endearing to the editor, but you always have to work in service of the story. Always, always, always. And if something is wonderful but does not move it forward, then you have to do it. And there are very little regrets in terms of that. Sometimes it's the scene that got the director excited in the first place, so it's very painful for the director to see it go, but they'll always eventually come around to the fact, maybe it wasn't the best thing for the film.
And over the course of the 3 years, we'll make so many iterations. I've got 8 different versions of MOANA. and 6 of them are really, really bad. But there's a couple that are like, well, there's some interesting things here, and you might throw something out. We always say throw the baby out with the bathwater. But then a year later, someone's going to remember that. You know, we had that scene. Why do we get, now that was good. Let's look at that again. So fortunately, it's all digital and in the Avid, and you can just call it up and say, you know what, now we could tweak this and make it work. So hopefully you're able to put some of your darlings back in if you're lucky.
Or just steal a gag from it and.
Yeah, anything that
Yeah.
you can grab from it.
So well, I don't know if you can share it with us. What were the 6 versions?
We just
You know,
went
when it
down so
started.
many different roads. I know at one point MOANA had 6 brothers, and it was the dad and the brothers that went off in search of this magical island Tafiti. And I gotta say, everyone knew from the beginning, it's like, this is so sexist. MOANA is not going because she's a girl. We cannot do this. In earlier versions, we didn't have the Tala character, so MOANA had really no ally to kind of help motivate her to get her going again. We also had earlier versions where when MOANA and Maui were out looking for Tafiti, they came across this tiny little island with one little palm tree, and that palm tree had like a tree spirit, and they decided they wanted to take it with them, so they turned him into a tiki, and they called him Moki Moki. And he was like the comic relief. The biggest problem with that is that he was a wooden version of Olaf. So it's like, okay, no matter how you look at it, this wasn't going to work. So, like I said, just a lot of different directions and figuring out what works, what doesn't.
Was Hey Hey a last minute?
Hey Hey and Pooh have been in from day one. That's definitely a John Musker, Ron Clements thing. If they can ever put in a cute little animal, they will do it. So I think they've been there from day one, so, yeah.
When you guys were doing Box Troll, were you worried how dark it was? You know, I mean, those are kind of scary trolls.
Yeah, I mean, there was a real balancing act between the darkness of it and the sort of cuteness of them in a sort of not conventional way. But I don't think it was ever really a worry. It was, you know, trying not to retread the same ground, trying to do something different and original and not be derivative. So it was something that was approached with confidence. People who design the characters, it, you know, has to go through the approval process and everything needs to be squared away, but that was never really the concern. And I think that the animators brought such a lovable quality to them that they ended up not being scary.
Walt has a question. Microphone?
Test. The question to Jeff, you talked about that all these versions didn't get there, and the press, I think Disney did a good job of saying that there's a lot of research on the whole Pacific Islander thing, the Polynesian background, the gods and all that. I mean, was that true? Do you guys actually have people that helped out on that? What was your impression on
Oh my God, I
that
can't
influence?
tell you enough of how much research goes into this. And that was something that John Lasseter has always pushed on. Whenever we start a movie, he wants the directors to do research. And Ron and John, with the producer, writer, head of story, they took multiple trips to the Polynesian islands. And it wasn't sitting poolside, you know, with margaritas. I mean, they were going to little villages and meeting with religious leaders and just finding out as much as they could about this culture. And we even got to a point where they worked with a group and they formed the Oceanic Story Trust, which is a bunch of advisors and experts about the culture from the islands. And every step of the way, we would let them see script pages or we would let them see certain screenings. And they would tell us if we were, no, you guys can't do that. That's not culturally sensitive or that's not working. And sometimes it was little things, like for the longest time, Maui was bald. I thought that would be a greater contrast, bald Maui with MOANA with all of her hair. But the Oceanic Story Trust said, you know what, there's many different versions of Maui, but every single version, he has a lush head of hair. So we gave him hair. We also found out that women in that culture do not climb palm trees, not even to get a coconut. And in our first couple of screenings, we did have gags with MOANA climbing a palm tree. So we took that out just to, you know, we're always very, very conscious of cultural sensitivity.
Well, I had read somewhere that the Maoris had an issue with some of his tattoos.
That's, you know, it's
Was
tough,
that
and there's so
just-
much that I can't speak about because I just don't
Yeah.
know, but I also know that there are so many different cultures in the Polynesian islands. You know, you make this group happy, it might not work with this group. So, yeah, we tried to figure out that balance of how many, let's try to make as many people happy as we can.
Right.
So.
You guys were talking about working and bringing your own creativity to the table and giving directors different options. My question is, when you work with a director for the first time, when is that moment where you feel comfortable bringing a new idea to the director versus just doing what they want and, yeah.
Well, one thing that working for Walter Murch taught me is you never know, you have to offer something up. You don't know what is right, so how about this? And I think that's an important thing to come in with. You don't know what is right. You assemble the sequence, you do what they want, but you also give them an alt. And the deal is, they don't have to accept any idea from it. They don't, there's no pressure if they want to go with the full version, but I always cut an alternate version for every sequence. There's the full version and the alternate version that offers up different ideas. And even if they don't like it, very frequently they go, I don't like that, but that gives me an idea. And your job is to keep plussing it, and that's part of it. So I think that you shouldn't be shy about offering ideas as long as you've achieved what you've promised. Here's the full version. As pitched, as you've approved, but here's some other ideas. And I think that that's an important thing to introduce early on or have discussions about. If there's no time to achieve a full alternate version, you can say, well, in order to clarify this, what if we do that? And have that dialogue straight away.
Ditto. No, you said it so well. That's exactly our approach. It's like, we always say, well, let's give every storyboard its day in the sun. This is what was pitched to me. This is what I'm going to cut together. I can see areas that aren't working, but it's there. And then we will work on an alternate version, sometimes 2 or 3. And depending on the mood, it's like, okay, I'll show them the full version, then I'll show them my alts. But there have been times where I'm saying, okay, I know the alt is so much better. I'm just going to show it to them, see if they see what's missing, see if they have any comments, and we'll take it from there. So, but right, it's a lot of back and forth.
And there are also directors who will say, just show me the alt.
Yeah.
I remember the pitch, just show me the alt.
Yeah.
I think it's also how you present your new idea. You don't want to get pushy about it.
Yeah.
It's all about diplomacy, is how you, and it's reading the director. What kind of mood is he in? Is he in a mood where he's going to be receptive to your new idea? Or then you go, oh, I think I'll wait another day.
Not on this project, but on a bunch of other projects, I've always avoided the 4 o'clock screening time because that's when blood sugar, it's like 4 o'clock, no, I'll take 3, I'll take 5, not 4.
How about
not
10
4.
o'clock in the morning?
Right.
Everyone's
That's it.
awake, cup of
That's it.
coffee.
Yeah.
Anybody else? Great.
You guys are both editors in the animation workforce. So my question is, are you in the Animation Guild or Editors Union?
It's Editors Guild,
Yeah.
Okay.
Motion Picture Editors Guild, and that encompasses anybody that's an editor, like animation,
Right.
live action. Well, we also have the sound people in our union as well, sound editors, Foley walkers, mixers. So Loco 700 encompasses all of post-production, yeah.
But also, I cut live action as well. It just sort of is very deceptive in that the animation projects take that long and the live action projects take a third as long.
And how you get into the Loco 700 is if you work on a non-union show for 100 days, you can get in as an assistant if you show your pay stub. And a lot of people have done that. There's a lot of video transfer houses that are non-union. And so if you're interested in doing that, that's the simplest way to get in. Yeah. Well, I think we're going to wrap it up. Thank you so much for coming out on a Saturday afternoon to share your experiences with us.
Thank you for having us.
Really
This is
informative.
great.
Thank you.
Thanks.